Thank you for joining me today on the Homeowners Be Aware podcast. Flooding is the most common type of natural disaster worldwide. About 40% of all natural disasters involve flooding. In case you weren't aware, homeowners insurance doesn't cover flood-related damage. In many instances, a homeowner fixes flood damage, passes the house off to an unknowing buyer, and it becomes their problem. Now, hot potato is a fun game unless you end up holding the potato at the end. Well, my guest today is Cleighton Smith, a water resources engineer and floodplain manager in New Jersey. Cleighton has over 45 years of experience with flooding issues. He has eye-opening advice that we all need to hear about flooding. I'm George Siegel, and this is Homeowners Be Aware, the podcast that teaches you everything you need to know about being a homeowner. Cleighton, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, you're very welcome, George. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate your time. Now, you and I met at the New Jersey Association of Floodplain Managers, and what you were talking about with me resonates deeply with me because to me, it's one of the most important things in people buying a house, their transaction, and that's knowing really what you're buying. So tell us what it is that you're working on in this area because you're doing some important work.
Well, I've been working in this community called Manville in central New Jersey for a number of years, helping them with floodplain management issues and their community rating service, which I helped them improve their score in. But then a few years ago, Hurricane Ida hit, and Manville was like ground zero in the entire state of New Jersey. It was very, very hard hit, and so I've been working extensively there since then. But one of the and many issues have come up, but one of them has been the lack of clarity when people go to buy a house. I mean, so many people I talked to after Ida had no clue they were in a floodplain. The realtors didn't tell them, which isn't surprising. We're working to get a new flood disclosure law passed in New Jersey. It's actually passed in New Jersey, but we don't have any. I don't think the rules have been written yet. I'd like to have some input into that process. But furthermore, there's errors in the FEMA maps are extremely old and misleading, and in some places just flat out wrong. And when people look at these areas and say this is not even in a 500-year floodplain, and yet these houses had 3 feet of water on the first floor. It's just some of that's due to the fact that there was historically they were in a 500-year floodplain in the old maps. When they created these county-wide maps, it somehow got left off in the county-wide process. So I'm working on getting that map corrected, but it's an uphill battle to try to get people to be aware of when they buy a house. I get people calling me all the time. When somebody goes to buy a house, they contact some of them will contact Borough Hall and ask about what restrictions they might have if they want to improve the house, and they always have them call me. And even if a house is not in the floodplain, we have satellite imagery we're very fortunate to have satellite imagery from Ida. Apparently the day after the flood, this Maxar satellite that sits above the earth Manville was in the absolute right position with no clouds, and they got beautiful high-res imagery of Ida. I mean, literally before the flood had receded, and it's very, very helpful to show people okay, how do you know this house flooded? Well, take a look at this picture. It's in my you can stick my PowerPoint that I gave the last day of the conference had some of these imagery in there. It's very powerful. So
yeah, and people don't understand that, and it's interesting. I was on a podcast last night, the Toolman Tim podcast, and one of the people listening asked me how accurate those FEMA maps were. And I said, look, I would not use that as the gospel if you're buying a house. It's a great way to go on FEMA.gov and see the zone that you're in, but you still want to go another step after that and do some more research.
Yeah, what I tell people is those, because I've spent a lot of my career making those maps, so I know what they're based on. I know what the assumptions are based on, and they're prepared as kind of as both a regulatory tool and a planning tool. It's not meant to be the end-all predictor of where the flood's going to go. One of my buddies at FEMA years ago said, rising water can't read a map. So you don't want to sit on the dry side of the line saying, well, I guess I'm okay here, because you're not. And
Yeah. And then another thing people don't understand, I hope you can talk about this, is okay, why should they care beyond just the house possibly flooding? It has a lot to do if there's a record of that house flooding, whether you'll even be able to get insurance for it at all.
Right. Well, insurance is another issue that it's to me in a kind of state of flux. To me, and Florida maybe is different than New Jersey, but from what I understand, FEMA insurance is different than private. There's a lot of private insurance out there, and I'm not really an insurance expert, so a lot of what I say should not be held as gospel. But if I'm not mistaken, FEMA insurance cannot deny someone insurance. Private insurers can, but FEMA, as long as the community you live in participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, they can charge you all they want for it, but they can't deny you insurance, from what I understand.
Right, but it can sure cost a lot of money for your regular insurance if they know that house is going to flood. I mean, obviously, regular homeowners insurance doesn't cover flooding, but I can't imagine State Farm or one of those people saying, "Yeah, that house was under 10 feet of water. Here's a reasonable policy to cover it."
But see, it's not their underwriting. It's FEMA. From my understanding, the NFIP underwrites that, not State Farm.
Just for flooding, but I'm talking about
flooding.
Overall homeowners insurance.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yep.
Yeah.
But they don't cover the flood. Anything that water touches, they don't cover.
Right, but if that house becomes uninhabitable because it floods, there's other issues with your insurance.
That's true.
I know people in Florida have a nightmare getting insurance.
Yeah. In Manville, I can't get enough people to buy it because the people that are outside the map floodplain don't have to, and a lot of them are living there because that's about all they can afford. And if they had to buy insurance, they are, it would break the bank. And that's led to, I can't tell you how many foreclosures have been in Manville after Ida. That's another thing we don't talk about. Some of these people who this is all they could afford. I have a database called propertyrecords.com that I can look into this, and I've made a list for some of the people to state of because we're curious how many foreclosures that we know about in Manville, and there's at least 20 or 30 just in the last couple of months. I mean, last couple of years. It's very unfortunate, and I think that more people had insurance, we could help maybe prevent some of these. But it's very sad. There's a lady from Wells Fargo who called me once who deals with foreclosures all across the country, and she said 2 of them she was working on were on the same street in Manville. So
Tom Little of floodproofing.com was in our last film, and he talked about how people don't understand, if you're not in the flood zone, having flood insurance is not that expensive, and it may be the best investment you could make.
Yep, absolutely. And Risk Rating 2.0 has changed that a little bit, but not that much. They don't have what's called preferred risk policy anymore. But I still think if you're not in the flood zone, really doesn't have an impact on the rate you pay anymore. It's more based upon proximity to the flooding source, and they've actually created a black box so that most people can't figure out what the premium's based on.
Well, you also have to figure out where that water is coming from. Now, I know if you're right on the coast, you have to worry about storm surge, but a lot of people inland, a little further away from the water, could be getting water from other sources that end up flooding them, and that's a big problem.
Well, that's another issue that the flood maps don't cover. It's kind of, I'm involved in a lot of different conferences and committees, and one of the hot new topics is what's been called pluvial flooding. River flooding is we call fluvial, but pluvial is when you get so much rain it just can't go anywhere. And a lot of people in Manville and all across the state got flooded this way because the intensity of the rain is so strong that it'll just fill up all the low spots. And some of them, the houses on the lowest house on the block often got flooded by a foot or two, and they were nowhere near a floodplain. We saw quite a bit of this in Manville, and other places in the state. And there are people trying to create models to try to create these pluvial maps, which is kind of the next stage in trying to predict where the floodwaters go.
Now, for people who don't think that flooding is a big issue, the most common type of natural disaster worldwide is flooding. 40% of all natural disasters involve flooding. 75% of all presidential disaster declarations are associated with flooding. That should get people's attention.
Doesn't surprise me in the least. I've been doing this all my adult life pretty much, and it's sad, but it's not doesn't surprise me in the least. The other thing is, I think this number varies from time to time, but about 30% of FEMA's annual flood claims come from people who don't live in mapped floodplains.
Yeah,
and that number would be would be higher if more people outside the floodplain had flood insurance. The problem, if you don't live in the floodplain, you don't have to get flood insurance. So people who are able to file these claims are people who are proactive and realize that maybe they should have flood insurance. And again, a lot of these claims come from people outside of flood insurance. And the other thing is, after a presidential disaster, FEMA can offer what's called individual assistance. And if I would have, I can't show you that map because it's privately protected, but I've seen it. And these maps of this industrial, the IA map of Manville is like the blue, yellow dots all across the community. Places nowhere near floodplain get flooded enough to file for FEMA's individual assistance program, which is crazy.
Well, I had an insurance agent tell somebody I know that lives in a high-rise condo here in Tampa, where I live, to get flood insurance, even though their unit wouldn't necessarily be disrupted by flooding, but it covered other disruptions to the building if that was flooding. So you really want to ask your insurance agent or have somebody explain to you when you're buying that policy. And the policy is not going to be written by that agent, but they sure help you get that. And that's important to understand all the different coverages that you would have under it.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I'm not really an insurance expert, but yes, when you think about insurance in a condo, well, I'm on the 20th floor. Well, suppose your elevator goes out for 2 or 3 days, or your power goes out and you're stuck with rotten food in the fridge. I'm not sure how much flood insurance will cover, but some of it should be. These are things people need to think about, because people will tell you, look, why should I evacuate? Look how high I am. Well, suppose you have a medical emergency and the 3 feet of water in the streets and the ambulance can't get there. I mean, you got to think about these things too.
Yeah, and if you're above floors 2 or 3, and you have to imagine what it would be like going in and, especially if you're an older person, what it would be like going in and out of that building on a regular basis with no elevator, that could get pretty old.
Yep. So, yeah, these are things that people need to consider when they think about it. Because the other thing with flooding is like, well, it's always somebody else. It's not me. Well, that's again the wrong way to think too.
So talk to me about human nature, because you have people contacting you all the time. Why do people have this attitude? I know when I was talking at the conference, one of the things I kind of like to make fun of is this, well, maybe this will serve as a wake-up call. Hello, we should already be awake. Why are we not awake already?
Yeah. Well, I think the individual homeowner doesn't have flood. They don't. It's not their day in and day out job the way that it's mine. So, when I look at these conferences, the one you attended, to me, this is wonderful stuff, but it's really us preaching to the choir. What you're doing, creating a podcast that's trying to grab the attention of the average homeowner, I think is where our efforts should be focused. It is very challenging to try to get the individual homeowner to pay more attention to this stuff. Flood disclosure laws would be really, really important, so that people, when they go to buy a house, it's not just, am I in the floodplain, but has this house flooded before? I tell people, if you really want to know, go look when you're viewing the house, go into the base, wherever the furnace is, and look at the sticker on it and when it was installed and inspected. If it's right around the time of a flood, then that area got damaged. So these are little things you can do to help people be more aware.
Now, although they don't have to tell you in some states, you can certainly ask and have that put in the contract that they say that the house is never flooded. I think we could solve at least part of this problem right this second by saying, look, everybody ask this question. I have a list of questions I think people should ask the people they're buying from. That's near the top. Right.
And the other thing that the FEMA maintains a database that we can't share, this repetitive loss database. We use it when we're in this community rating system if we are above a certain number of repair law structures, we have to have a plan on how we're going to reduce them. So we have to have that data, but we can't share it. We can't say this particular house has had 10 claims or 5 claims. But what I can share is, and people frequently ask me after Ida, we did what's called substantial damage work, where we went out and inspected the houses, all these houses that get flooded. And if the cost to repair is more than 50% of the market value of the house, that we put a tag on it that house either has to take a voluntary buyout or has to be elevated. And it's been a hard process to get compliant, but we're slowly but surely working on it. But those letters I've learned are fully disclosable. So when a realtor lists a house that's been substantially damaged, I said, well, maybe the homeowner didn't share this with you, but I'm sharing it with you. And they've had and several of these buyers have come to me and said, how high do I have to lift it? And that's how we're getting a lot of these lifts, is through the realtor, who once they know, they have to disclose it.
Now, I'm not a cheerleader for the insurance industry by any stretch of the imagination. So I got to ask you, I know you don't work for them either, but why aren't they insisting on this? Why do they continue to allow, or not just put their foot down and say, if you don't fix it to a certain standard, we're not going to insure it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. Right now, it's currently the SD process is actually in every single community's mandatory ordinance that FEMA makes them adopt. So technically speaking, every community should be doing this, but I know it's not done universally, and FEMA doesn't really hold communities' feet to the fire that don't do it. But it's strict. It's more right now. It's a compliance issue between it's FEMA's way to retrofit the older structures with this term pre-firm. The structures were built before the flood maps came out. No one knew where the flood maps were going to end up. In Manville, most of our infrastructure was built in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and some in the 60s. So these are older homes with basements that flood. So, the insurance industry should be more invested in this than they are. I'm not quite sure how to make that happen, but you're right. It is something that should happen.
One of the things I met so many interesting people at that conference, and what a lot of them were talking to me about is how complicated the behind the scenes issues are for building codes and getting things designated, that there's a lot that goes on that the consumer does not know about. What I really want to talk about, though, is, since we have to do everything we can to protect ourselves, what should the average person be thinking when they're looking at a property to buy a house, whether it's Manville or anywhere else?
Well,
what should our process be?
I'm going to answer that in two questions. Number one, you should know the community you're buying in. I see the people who buy in Manville aren't the people. Manville has a kind of a reputation in central New Jersey. So in communities around Manville, everybody knows it has this reputation of flooding. But what I'm saying is we're in the metro New York area. So a lot of people that I have talked to are people who have moved there from Brooklyn or Staten Island, who may not know, say this is about 45 minutes from New York. That seems like in an area that I can afford to buy a house. So this is the kind of the people so those individuals need to say, well, wait a minute, this house is very affordable for a reason. So I should be asking questions of why it is. Because see, I've also learned Somerset County is like the number one. It's got the highest average income in the whole state of New Jersey. So it's a fairly wealthy county. And Manville is kind of like the one little tiny borough within Somerset County that's affordable. So there's a reason for that, and people should be asking that question.
Yeah.
Why is it so affordable? That's one thing I should point out. It's because it's easy to check if you're in a floodplain, but you need to find out more. And those sources can be talking to the people at the Borough Hall, the construction office, if they've had to issue any flood-related permits for buildings. I mean, that's easy information, whether the community's in CRS or not. I mean, was there a recent flood and someone have to come in for a permit to get a new sticker, a new furnace or hot water heater or that sort of thing.
So now tell people who have been fortunate never to have experienced flooding how miserable it is when that occurs. Because I've had a basement that flooded because the sump pump broke, and we only had about a foot of water in there, but it was a nightmare for months. Yeah. Imagine it's your whole house.
Let me tell you this. When I first went to Manville after the flood, this is, I think, the day that Biden was there, I drove down just a basic street that was in the floodplain. If you can just picture everybody's stuff, these are small Cape houses. Everything that they own is on between the house and the curb. Everything that they own is out there, and that's every single house, both sides of the street, for 6 or 8 blocks. You turn the corner, come back the other way, exact same thing. It's hard to put into words. It's just really depressing to see. This is like every single person. This is hundreds and hundreds of people affected this way. And it's just, it's just imagine you live in a 1-story house, and just imagine one day 4 feet of water is just barges in and there's nothing to do about it. So
yeah, people need to understand the amount of mold you have to deal with. The floor has to go, the cabinets, anything that comes in proximity to the ground. The water wicks up in the walls. So your electrical, your insulation, it can be substantial.
Oh yeah, yeah. I tell you, and the smell, like the smell from the mold. This has happened in the, late summer. So yeah, the mold was just excruciating. Yeah, it's tough. It's really an image once you've seen it, you'll never get out of your head.
It's bad. And not to keep kicking the insurance industry, but they don't sponsor anything that I'm doing, so it's okay. I saw a video recently, a mini documentary that an attorney made who has to sue them all the time, and it was interviews with his clients and the runaround and the treatment that they had to go through as they try to get their lives back, with adjusters changing, denial. So eventually they wear a lot of people out, so they just go away. I mean, it's not a clean process even getting paid.
No, it's really, there was one lady in particular, a very sad story, who's a single mom, disabled daughter. FEMA said her damages were, I don't know, $70,000-$80,000, and her contractor said her damages were like $120,000, and she couldn't get FEMA to agree to what the contractor said, and the contractor wouldn't do it for what FEMA said, and she took out a small business loan to try to cover the difference, and it was just it's very, very. I'm still not sure where she ended up. She's trying to get Blue Acres to buy the house. Blue Acres, by the way, is a state of New Jersey program that facilitates the buyout process. They kind of do the legwork that a lot of communities in other states have to do themselves. It's a pretty good process. And it works reasonably well, but it's extremely slow. It takes years for it to go from start to finish.
Yeah, and nobody has years when something like that happens. It's painful. And so the people that were in this documentary that I saw, I mean, these weren't actors. These were real people, and you could see the pain on their face when they talk about what it's like. It's just horrible.
I believe it. Yeah, I've seen it obviously firsthand in many times. It's tough to see. It's really not much you can say to a lot of people. Like, other than here's the process. Here's where you can go. Here's where you can talk to. Sometimes I get help from FEMA. Sometimes they don't. It's just FEMA brings a lot of reservists in when there's a disaster, and so I'm not sure all of them are super well trained in how to handle things. But I know there's a lot of denials, and there were a couple of people who came to me, and I went to someone at FEMA and got their case reopened, and a few times we've had them actually change the decision. So
now, should we actually? I know it's not a popular thing to say, but should we not be able to live in dangerous areas? Are we maybe seeing more damage because we're encroaching on dangerous areas more and more, and that just makes it worse?
Well, there's a lot to be said about that. In Manville, it's a situation where the area's already been built. There's a discussion. One of the more a recent decision has been made by the state that they don't want to see elevations in certain parts of Manville because they think it's just too risky to lift a house. Even you're still in a dangerous area, you still have to put first responders at risk. So, it's been kind of a controversial thing because we can have private lifts in these areas, but we can't get the federal government to help some of these lifts. So and again, the basis is public safety, which, you can't argue with that. But anyway, I don't want to go too further into that. But yeah, there are areas where people shouldn't be building, and that the FEMA and their mapping program was originally supposed to help lead that charge. But I think what's happened is the ability to get flood insurance in a risky area has sort of upended that original effort. But I do a lot of training, and in floodplain management. I've had to look into the history of the floodplain mapping program, and the original intent was not to provide insurance for risky development. It was to provide a guideline for where we should be building, where we shouldn't be building. The whole concept of floodplain management was a counter to flood control projects. The TVA did a lot of flood control projects in the 50s, but they also looked at floodplain management in rural areas where they couldn't really justify building a project. Some of the early concepts of floodplain management came out of the TVA's work in the 50s. And so the original intent, was really to provide these maps of areas where we have to build. If we do build, we have to build to a certain standard, but we do make sure there are some areas that you shouldn't be building at all. So
now, if we changed our focus from being reactive to being more proactive, do you think it would make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, sure. That can be an uphill fight. There's fewer and fewer places to build these days, and builders are being more and more creative to try to work around whatever proactive steps we want to take. So a lot of it involves partnerships, based on common sense. So
yeah, common sense. It's funny. Right down the street from where I live, there was one huge old house that was right on the water of Tampa Bay. And they sold it, they tore it down, and they're building 8 or 10 houses there that are going to be right on Tampa Bay. Now, they're going to be expensive homes, so I'm hopeful they're going to be very well built, but it's a risky spot.
Elevated and high, and but then the other thing is, like, people don't think about is dry land access. I can be 8 feet up in the air and protected in an event, but if all the streets around me are underwater for days, doesn't really help me. Unless they have a boat, kayak.
Yeah, well, the people that live right on the water probably all have boats. They'll be doing okay. So did we miss anything, Clayton? Is there something you wanted to mention that I didn't ask you?
I'm just looking over my notes. One of the things I like to tell people is when you look at flood maps and things that are created for regulatory purposes, the other thing I do is I create maps that are specific for getting permits and such. When you work with the regulatory process, you're in the regulatory world, and I try to tell people the regulatory world and the real world should never be confused to be the same thing. Just because you don't have to get flood insurance doesn't mean you're at no risk of flooding. The regulatory maps are there because the insurance industry needs to ask you to get flood insurance if you're getting a mortgage in that area. But that doesn't mean if you pay cash, you don't have to get flood insurance. I've talked to many people in Manville who bought houses with cash and were stuck with the damages because they just didn't stop to consider the fact that they were going to get flooded. The real world and the regulatory world are two different places, and I like to live in the real world. Although I can help you in the regulatory world, the real world is where we live.
Well, you should tell people that they hope that if they meet you, it's in a bar having a beer or something, and not because they're calling you because they're underwater.
Exactly.
Well,
yep.
Hey, Clayton, it was so good to meet you. I appreciate the time when you were talking to me up in Atlantic City, and I appreciate you coming on today. You had some great advice.
Great. Thanks very much, George. Good luck with this, and let me know if you want to do this again sometime on a different topic.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
If you have a story about your experience as a homeowner, good or bad, I'd like to hear from you. There's a contact form in the show notes. Fill it out, and you may be a guest on an upcoming episode. And if you like what you were listening to today, please become a subscriber so you don't miss an episode. A new one comes out every Tuesday morning. Thanks for listening. See you next time.